Welcome back to the Nest Summit and Climate Week. While the debate rages on about whether climate change is real or not in the United States, rating agencies and wealth management and asset management companies are moving well beyond the debate and starting to actually look at rating physical assets. In order to get a better understanding of how this world is working, we have 427 as a guest today at the Nest Summit, and Yoon Kim is from 427. Thank you so much for joining us, Yoon.
Thank you for having me.
So, Yoon, when we talk about physical risks in climate change, what exactly are we talking about, and what is 427 looking at?
So when we refer to physical climate risks, we're talking about both acute and chronic risks. Acute risks refer to extreme events, so things like floods, droughts, the wildfires that we're experiencing here in Northern California. Chronic impacts refer to the longer-term, slower onset changes that we expect to see, things related to rising temperatures and sea level rise. And as far as what these types of hazards mean for companies as well as for financial institutions' portfolios, some recent examples include, for instance, the flooding of some area, part of the Wuhan area, which is located on the Yangtze River. So this region experienced water levels that were the fourth highest in recorded history for this area, which disrupted the production of key PPE-related inputs, as well as disrupting the transport of these goods, which, as you can imagine, during a pandemic is not a good impact. And another recent-ish example is that of PG&E, which ended up declaring bankruptcy in the wake of the 2018 and 2019 fires because of outstanding liabilities from these devastating fires. And so it resulted in the company's rating being reduced to junk status. And so these types of impacts will affect companies both in terms of their corporate facilities as well as their value chains. And it will be through impacts on companies as well as on real estate and housing and other types of real assets that we'll see impacts on financial institutions' portfolios. And so in terms of a more recent example, when we think about Hurricane Laura, Moodys estimated the economic impact to be approximately $20 billion. Many homeowners lack insurance. And so in the 4 Texas counties that were directly affected by the storm, only about a third have flood insurance. And even those homeowners and businesses that do have insurance, if their economic situations have been adversely affected by the pandemic, they may find it difficult to pay premiums and or repairs, which in turn will have implications for the portfolios of mortgages that, for instance, lending institutions hold.
So I think when people think about physical risks, what they're thinking about historically has been measured is the damage that storms, for instance, do to property valuations, and that's a backward-looking view. I want you to give the audience some insight into how 427 is looking forward on these physical risks and what actual data are they digging into?
Yes, so we know now that because of climate change, historical data is no longer a useful indication of what the future will hold. And so we leverage the outputs of global climate models that have explicitly been built to model a climate into the future. And so we leverage the outputs of best-in-class, peer-reviewed data that's developed by, for instance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, NASA, and NOAA. And using this data, our analytics enable the identification of exposure of any location in the world to hazards such as floods, heat stress, and so on, based on highly granular data. And so, for instance, for floods and sea level rise, we can identify and evaluate exposure to these hazards at 90 by 90 meters, enabling our clients to differentiate risk site by site, even in areas that are generally high risk.
And they're doing this with risks across heat, flood, droughts. What areas specifically can you cover in all this forward-looking data?
Our data is global in nature, and so for both things like real assets, when we think about real estate, infrastructure, and corporate facilities, we can provide that granularity of analysis regardless of where an asset is located in the world. And then when it comes to company level risk, we've developed a set of company scores that incorporate not only insights based on the specific facility footprint of a given company, but supplemented that with insights regarding supply chain and market risk.
Give me an example of what type of clients are actually purchasing and using this data and how they're using the data.
We work with a very broad range of clients, including some of the world's largest investors, asset managers, commercial banks, companies, development finance agencies, and government agencies. And when it comes to our real asset-related analytics, they use it to enhance portfolio analysis and monitor risk as their portfolio holdings change over time, as well as to inform due diligence processes and establish internal standards regarding assessment for high-risk assets. When it comes to our data, things like our company scores, they use it to evaluate the long-term exposure of portfolio holdings and engage with management teams to foster resilience investments, to incorporate equity scores into portfolio construction and risk assessment, as well as to inform reporting.
It really is incredible how much data is now available in order to make these assessments. Do you think that the capital markets are starting to wake up to these risks?
Yes, and there's a lot of some important drivers in this trend that we're seeing to pay closer attention to physical climate risks. Has been driven by increasing interest on the part of investors, regulators, and credit rating agencies, as well as efforts on the part of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So when we think about investor interest, pension funds and other investors representing almost $1 trillion in assets called on the Fed, the securities, the SEC, and other financial regulators to act on climate change concerns in order to avoid economic disaster. And so basically these investors worry that if regulators don't take action soon, climate change can cause some companies' values to drop suddenly, potentially destabilizing the economy, keeping in mind that the U.S. has already experienced more than $500 billion in economic losses between 2015 and 2019. Another example is BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, in his annual letter to CEOs, highlighting the magnitude and long-term persistent nature presented by climate risks and the imperative of addressing them. And then the TCFD has played a critically important role in crystallizing the growing concern amongst investors and business leaders about the potential physical impacts of climate change on the economy and financial markets. And so the TCFD calls for the disclosure of both physical and transition risks to enable better understanding of the potential impacts of climate on corporate value chains, infrastructure, and their transmission channels to financial markets. And then, of course, credit rating agencies are paying closer attention to this issue, too. And we'll hear more about that from my colleague, Swami Venkataraman at Moodys Investor Service.
So first we heard from 427 and got a better understanding of how this data is being utilized. The thing that got me the most interested about where we were going in regards to climate risk is when I heard that Moodys was acquiring 427. And today we have Swami Venkataraman on from Moodys to discuss their acquisition of 427 and how they're taking that data and embedding it into the rating side. Swami, welcome to the NEST Summit.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be here.
So, Swami, when you're looking at this physical risk data, first of all, what was the turning point for Moodys in really realizing that they had to start adapting this data into the process and the work that you do?
Well, we've been looking at incorporating climate risk, especially in being able to more consistently and more in a more sophisticated manner talk about long-term physical trends. And we needed the expertise that 427 brings in terms of long-term modeling of climate trends. There is public data available from different sources, but the kind of capability that 427 brings is really unique, and that's really what what got us interested in working with 427 and eventually taking an ownership interest in them. I think what it does is it really gives us the ability, as I show in my slide here, to really talk about what we think about climate trends and how they work them into credit analysis. So, for example, emissions today really affect climate and weather conditions only with a long lag period. And so really what we're talking about is for the next 20 years, maybe even 30 years, a lot of what's going to happen is already baked in through the emissions that have happened in the past. But what we really don't know is how much the emissions that have happened are going to change or affect the climate. What sort of temperature increases are we going to see? What kind of impact is it going to have on sea level rise or water stress or rainfall and hurricanes and so on? And so what 427's data gives us, it enables us to see what different climate models are predicting in terms of these variables, in terms of these climate and weather variables. And what we can do is we can construct low, medium, and high scenarios for various time periods, as you see in the slide. And that really is what it gives us a very strong analytical foundation upon which to base our analysis. So any given point in time, we can speak about what is the low end of expectations from climate models and what's the high end of expectations from climate models.
Can you provide specific examples of how this risk analysis is brought into the credit rating process?
Sure, happy to. And a few of my following slides really speak to that. What I've done is I've taken actual research that Moodys has published based on 427 data. And I will show you briefly the kind of work that we have done. And in order to make it simpler to explain, I've really narrowed it down to one particular hazard, which is heat stress. Now, you can certainly talk about rainfall and hurricanes, and you can talk about a lot of other things, but just to illustrate the point, if you look at heat stress, for example, we looked at the US municipal debt market, and we looked at where is debt outstanding in the market, and where is the heat stress also expected to occur over time. And we got some results that were not so obvious, and which really speaks to why it is useful to have the kind of data that 427 does, right? I think people would obviously say, well, Arizona and Nevada, Southern California desert, that's really where the temperature increase is going to be the maximum. And that's true. That's certainly where the temperature increase is going to be the maximum. But if you really look at where capital markets and investors need to be concerned about, you got to marry that with where is debt outstanding as well. And what we found out was it was really the Midwest, the area around Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, that was really the most exposed from a debt perspective. And so it's not the most obvious result when you think of heat stress and impact on financial impact on investors. Similarly, we published results for heat stress on electric utilities based on the service territory that different utilities serve, which utilities are most exposed. And again, the answer didn't turn out to be the utilities in the Southwest, but it turned out to be utilities sort of in the Midwest of the country, and then certain other utilities, which are sort of diversified in many parts of the countries, but have a lot of exposure to heat stress as well. And then to your point, in terms of assets, Jeff, we are able to look at a specific address or a specific GPS code, if you will, anywhere on Earth, and find out what the impact is going to be over time. And we can use that, for example, when you look at REITs, and you can take their specific buildings, and you can look at each building and their exposure to heat stress. And you can look at, okay, what percentage of a particular REIT's assets are exposed to high heat stress. But not just that. Where we come in would be to bring an understanding of, okay, how important is that particular asset to the cash flows of the company, right? And you have to marry the analysis of credit and finance with the climate analysis that 427 brings in, and we published that as a report, in fact, just earlier this week, where we looked at all the US REITs and we rank ordered them by exposure to various climate studies. So this is sort of a quick example, but we intend to do this for all hazards across sectors to really be able to take this forward-looking perspective. And then when marrying it into the rating, what happens is today we are in a position where every single rating committee must have an ESG discussion, no exceptions. And that's even if the analyst believes that ESG is very low risk and this company is not going to be affected. The analyst has to show that that is the case and not simply assume that it to be the case. So every rating committee has that discussion. And part of those discussions involves us as the ESG specialists. We participate not necessarily in every rating committee, but where the risks are need discussion, we participate in those rating committees. And where those risks are deemed material, there is greater disclosure in press releases, in credit opinions, and in research to follow. So it sort of gives you an idea of the approach that we're trying to take. We are, and especially with climate as your example here, we are trying to be forward-looking, we are trying to be systematic, and we are trying to be very thorough in terms of the kind of data we use, take a very rigorous approach to understanding the implications of climate change for assets across the board.
Swami, I look at what Moodys is doing in 427, and we're going to speak to Wellington in a minute as well, as really being on the forefront of what's going on in climate risk in the capital markets. Can you, in the last minute that we have with you, just give me some sense of how much of the capital markets do you think have begun to truly acknowledge the risks posed by climate change in the capital markets?
I think it's a question where the answer is rapidly changing, right? And I think it's widely acknowledged that Europe seems to be more advanced or more ahead of the US and Asia in terms of taking cognizance of these issues. But I would say even in the US, it's rapidly changing. Banking regulators around the world are quickly moving to require stress tests of banking portfolios. That's one. Second, even in the case of asset managers, what you're seeing is the asset owners are really making systematic integration of ESG considerations as a requirement in order to give money over to asset managers to manage. And I'm sure Chris can speak more to that. We see that as a rapidly emerging trend. So I think while we might, the answer might vary, from January to today to maybe by the beginning of next year, I think the trend is clearly that it's moving rapidly in the right direction. We've seen a doubling of assets under management in the US under some form of ESG or sustainability mandate just in the last 3 or 4 years, and I think that really speaks to itself. And it's in the order of it's in the order of trillions of dollars now, and so that really speaks to the trend that we're looking at.
Thank you so much for joining us at the Nest Summit, Swami. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
And now on the Nest Summit, I'm joined by Chris Goolgasian from Wellington Asset Management. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Jeff. Our pleasure.
Chris, when I think about companies that are on the forefront in the asset management industry of dealing with climate risk and integrating that into their investment process, I really at least start with Wellington, certainly. And the work that you guys have been doing with Woods Hole and Spencer Glendon has really been on the forefront of this industry. Can you talk to the audience a little bit about how Wellington is integrating climate risk into their investment selection process?
Sure, Jeff, and appreciate the kind words. So we formed this really collaborative and I think innovative relationship with Woods Hole, which has now been renamed Woodwell, and a couple of our asset owner partners at Wellington to really study the effects of climate change on the capital markets, just in one sentence. So we view climate change as a risk to markets, and like all risks, we should have a view on it. And the real beginning of that process was to understand the science, and that is why we formed a collaboration with a scientific organization with the expertise of Woodwell. They have scientists across the globe in a variety of lanes of expertise. And so the first year we really spent studying what we thought were the 7 key climate risks to the markets, and those would be heat, drought, wildfire, hurricanes, flood, water scarcity, and air quality. And then really trying to map those risks onto global locations and understand where the hotspots would be in 10, 20, or 30 years. And then translate all of that for investors. And I use the word translate because I think that is the biggest hurdle. We have two disparate fields here in climate science and finance, and kind of never the two shall meet up until the last couple of years. And anytime you have two disparate fields, the real challenge is to connect their language, to translate what they mean to each other. And so we've spent a lot of time on that. I think the scientists would be the first to tell you that they're not great often at, perfectly communicating what the meaning or impact is in everyday terms. And, for this to be applicable to finance, we really have to do that. So we then translate all this climate risk into financial risk. And we spent a good portion of the early part of this work to develop a mapping tool so that everyone could visualize those risks. And I would say, to sum up here, the big conclusion on climate change and investment process is to think about two key words, which are location and duration, which is if you have a fixed location and a long maturity, to start with, those are the assets most at risk. And so we start there and then back into everything else.
As an asset allocator, when we looked into the marketplace at who was addressing climate change, what we saw most was that there were asset management firms looking at climate transition risk around carbon tax and stranded assets. What we couldn't find initially were firms that were actually looking at the physical effects of climate change. And because of lack of policy in the US, unfortunately, we know that under many assumptions, the next 20 years of physical risk are already really baked into the scenario analysis that people are doing. Wellington was one of the first firms that actually started integrating physical risk into their investment policy. How did you get there, and what are you seeing in the capital markets that's different than the rest of the asset management firms that are not getting there yet?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Jeff. I think the marketplace has a good 10 plus years now of looking at transition risk, mitigation effects, technology, renewables, electric automobiles, and really trying to understand how to mitigate the emission levels, but far less time spent on physical risks. And now I think there's been a recognition, and certainly with Woodwell, we got there in the last few years, that, as you said, and as Swami has said, much of this is inalterable. It can't be stopped for multiple decades. What we're trying to prevent now globally is the worst of outcomes over many, many more decades. But for some number of decades, a lot of this cannot be stopped. And so we actually show that in time horizons to our investors that we think are within their investment time horizon. So this is not 2100 year stuff. This is 2030s and 2040s. And so I think how we got there, to answer your question, was a realization with the scientists that, unfortunately, and people don't like this message, much of the worst effects of the 7 key risks are here to stay for a number of decades. And that's, as mentioned earlier, because the emissions are cumulative, and to date, we have no way of reversing them. And already, as we have seen just in the last few years and upcoming, we have some of the worst effects in place. So once you recognize that, then you say, well, actually, adaptation to physical risk is an equal, if not even more of a problem than just trying to mitigate and manage transition risk. And so it needs to be both. I think asset owners and asset managers need to view both of them as equals.
I want to thank 427 and Moodys and Wellington for joining us today and giving us a glimpse into how the capital markets are being affected by physical climate risk and climate change. Thank you all so much for joining me today.